Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Laura Bowley, and on behalf of Polar Knowledge Canada and Neole, I'd like to welcome you to the Canada and the Antarctic webinar. We are pleased to make this webinar available in 3 languages, Inuktitut, French, and English. The slide now displayed shows you where the interpretation button is on your Zoom toolbar and how to select the language that you wish to listen to. Just a note that when Inuktitut is spoken, you can switch to English to hear the interpretation. The interpretation instructions are also in chat. And Teresa, maybe you just want to drop those in again for people who have just joined. This webinar is the last in a series of webinars that Polar has held this month. And the series is called the Knowledge Sharing Webinar Series. I invite you to visit our website for more information on future webinars, and the link to Polar's website will be in chat in just a minute. There we go, thank you. Just to note that we are recording today's webinar. Be sure to check the website and also like Polar's Facebook page and also their YouTube channel, and watch for announcements of future webinars and also the recordings from this knowledge sharing series. Please do not hesitate to ask questions or provide comments in Inuktitut, French, or English. And we invite you to type your questions in the Q&A space on Zoom by clicking on the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. And you can see from the slide what that button looks like and where it is on your toolbar. Your questions will be addressed throughout the webinar and particularly during the panel discussion after the presentations. Now, I would like to thank all of you who have joined us today for this session from across the North and Canada, and indeed from around the world. I would like to acknowledge that since I am in Ottawa, Canada, I am on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I recognize that we are all joining today from different places. And for those of you in North America, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional Indigenous territory that you are joining from. In the spirit of these knowledge sharing webinars, we acknowledge the valuable contributions Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make, both with respect to sharing your lands, resources, skills, and knowledge. We further acknowledge a past that has done great harm and that much needs to be done to bring about true reconciliation. We appreciate that we have an obligation to learn, to listen, to be inclusive and respectful in all of our engagements. And now I'd like to introduce David Hick. David is Chief Scientist and Executive Director of Programs at Polar Knowledge Canada, based at the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay, Nunavut. His research focuses on the ecology, dynamics, and impacts of rapid climate change in the cold region environments. David previously served as Executive Director of the Canadian International Polar Year, IPY, Secretariat, President of the International Arctic Science Committee, and Vice Chair of the Arctic Council-led Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative. David, over to you for some opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. And I'd like to thank everyone who's taken time to join us today for this 6th and final webinar in the current knowledge sharing series. This is a little bit different from the last 3 weeks, the previous 5 webinars. We're going to turn our attention from the Arctic and the Canadian Arctic to the Antarctic. And I thought I would just take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the role that Polar Knowledge Canada plays in supporting research activities and environmental protection in the other polar region, in the Antarctic as well. Now, Polar's mandate is very broad. Polar works to advance knowledge in the Canadian North, and to promote the development and dissemination of knowledge in other circumpolar regions and the Antarctic. Today, I'm actually joining you from Reykjavik, Iceland. Canada works to support leadership on northern issues. And of course, we operate the fantastic Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Cambridge Bay. Now, just as by way of introduction to today's seminar, the Antarctic is a different place than the Arctic. The Arctic is centered around an ocean that's covered by a thin layer of perennial sea ice that is surrounded by land, the 5 Arctic countries that border the Arctic Ocean. The Antarctic is a continent that's covered by 2 to 3 kilometers of a thick ice cap, and it's surrounded by a rim of seasonal sea ice and the Southern Ocean. So very similar in some respects. They're both cold regions of our planet, but geographically and physiographically very, very different. In the Arctic, the North Pole, the average winter temperatures are about minus 40 degrees Celsius, and the summer temperatures are about 0 degrees Celsius. And in the Antarctic, at the South Pole, it's colder. The winter temperatures average around minus 60 degrees Celsius, and the summer temperatures are around minus 30 degrees. So one thing, though, that both polar regions have in common is they're experiencing very rapid warming. And you may have seen stories in the news this week showing temperatures that are extremely different from the normals, up to 40 degrees warmer than anticipated, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. Now, these maps are a little bit difficult to see, so I'm just going to show this in a slightly different format. Here you can see the North Pole and the South Pole at the bottom, and these darker red parts of the map show the difference in the temperature between what would be normally expected on the 18th of March, so last Friday. And in fact, you can see here this annual cycle of temperatures recorded over many years. So that's the green line, sort of the mean temperature at Dome C. So this is about 3,300 meters on the summit of the Antarctic, and the temperatures were 40 degrees above normal last Friday. This is extremely unusual and one of the indicators of the sorts of changes that are being observed in the polar regions. And Canada has been active in the Antarctic for almost a century, if not longer. The research that we have been conducting includes marine sciences, biology, geology, studies of the ice sheets and glaciers, astrophysics, looking at the Arctic weather. And there's a number of pioneers in Antarctic science, like Fred Roots, who's pictured here. Fred was a member of an expedition from 1949 to 1952. And in fact, his record of a 190-day unsupported dog sled journey across the continent still stands. And Fred was instrumental in supporting Canada's contributions to Antarctic science and the Antarctic Treaty over many decades. And Canada's commitment to the Antarctic is motivated by a number of factors. By contributing to science and research that is evidence-based to inform policy and decision-making, by our commitment to understanding climate change, not just in Canada, but in a planetary context, and to sharing our experience and best practices and lessons learned with international partners. And finally, our commitment to rules-based governance of international spaces. As you'll hear a little bit later from Anita Day-Nuttall, the Antarctic Treaty and the Antarctic as a whole is governed very differently from most of the rest of the world. And Canada is very happy to support those efforts. In terms of our commitments to the Antarctic, our formal commitments, and this is an important context for today's seminar, Canada became a non-consultative party member of the Antarctic Treaty in 1988, and since then has committed resources and expertise to research in the Antarctic through the Canadian Committee on Antarctic Research, through the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, or SCAR. We've ratified the Protocol on Environmental Protection, and in 2003, the federal government also passed the Antarctic Environmental Protection Act. And we're an observer of the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, which is a body that coordinates a lot of the activity that takes place in the Antarctic. And this year, in the next few months, Canada's applications for full membership to both the Antarctic Treaty and to the Committee of the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, or COMNAP, will be considered by other countries. And so there will be a number of other events we'll be hosting in the coming weeks and months leading up to these meetings and the consideration of Canada's applications to become full participants and members of these Antarctic organizations. So I think I'd like to turn it now to, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here. And I'd like to turn it now to Tom James. Tom is the chair of the Canadian Committee of Antarctic Research.
Thank you, David. I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I live and work. I'm going to speak very briefly on the nature of Canadian Antarctic research. And before I launch into this, let me get my PowerPoint going. So, okay, so the title slide shows a picture of a twin otter that's operated by Ken Boric Air. And Ken Boric is based out of Calgary. They provide logistical support to a number of national Antarctic programs. This picture is taken at Lone Wolf Nunatak at 82 South, where I was joined an American research program. And this is typical of Canadian Antarctic research. And next slide, please, David. So about 6 years ago, Polar Knowledge Canada convened a workshop to discuss Canadian Antarctic research and explore opportunities to strengthen Canadian Antarctic research. To focus discussion at the workshop, we identified 6 very broad themes, which I'll mention shortly. For the workshop and following the workshop, we've carried out bibliographic searches to discover in more detail the nature of published Canadian Antarctic research. And next slide, please. And what these searches demonstrate is that Canadian Antarctic research is sustained. This is a plot of number of publications over about the past 20 years, showing over the past 10 years, at least 70 papers or more, and at least 20 or so of those papers had Canadian lead authors indicating a leadership of in Antarctic science. And next slide, please. So the research themes for the workshop were very broad, and they also encompass a very broad range of Antarctic research, ranging from the geosciences, the first bullet looking at the fluid envelope and also the ice sheets in Antarctica. And then a theme that looks outwards, where Antarctica is really the platform for the scientific research that takes place. We have a theme that looking at landscapes and soils, a life science theme, and then finally a very broad theme that we termed human activities in Antarctica. And that ranges all the way from looking at the environmental impact of tourism in Antarctica to studying the physiological and psychological effects of isolation at remote research camps in Antarctica. And next slide. And what we found when we looked into Canadian Antarctic research across these themes, the biota and ecosystems theme is very well represented with about 400 papers over the last 20 years or so. But the fluid envelope theme, atmosphere, southern ocean, cryosphere, and also the geoscience theme are very well supported. So really, my point today is to indicate that Canadian Antarctic research is broad, as we can see from the contributions across these different themes. It's sustained, as we can see from the bibliographic results over the past 20 years. And it's substantial, as we see, as shown from the numbers. So with that point, today we will have two invited speakers, Anita Day Nuttall and Dermot Antoniadis. They're both members of the Canadian Committee on Antarctic Research, and we help polar with Antarctic matters, especially matters pertaining to Canadian Antarctic research. Anita is going to speak on the Antarctic Treaty System, and Dermot will talk about environmental change in the Antarctic Peninsula. And now Anita could start her deck. I'll ask people to put questions into the Q&A box. We'll read them out and discuss them after each presentation. And we also plan to have a panel discussion at the end. And so Anita Day Nuttall is on the faculty of the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Alberta. She focuses on polar science and policy engagement and teaches resource management and environmental policy. Her research interests are in science policy issues, the history and contemporary nature of national Antarctic programs, geopolitics, and security and sovereignty in the circumpolar regions. Anita is a member of the Canadian Committee for Antarctic Research, and Anita is a past chair of CCAR. And she's been involved in several U-Arctic initiatives. She's also been a visiting researcher at the Thule Institute at the University of Oulu in Finland, and she previously served as Associate Director of the Canadian Circumpolar Institute and U-Alberta North. Anita?
Thank you, Tom. I hope everyone can hear me. I just need a thumbs up. Okay, great. So thank you, Tom, for the introduction, and thank you, David, for your opening remarks, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today. I hope my screen is sharing okay, my PowerPoint. That's great. Thank you, Laura. So good morning from the University of Alberta in Edmonton, situated on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. I'm going to give you an overview of the Antarctic Treaty System, a legal framework within which a large number of countries engage in scientific research in the region. I will also briefly point to some of the emerging issues that are pressure points in Antarctic governance, particularly in the context of marine resources and environmental protection. Many of these issues arise from the impacts of climate change in Antarctica, especially on sea level rise and marine ecosystems. These impacts are having global environmental, economic, and social consequences. In the context of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which is running from 2021 to 2030, the marine component of the Antarctic gathers further significance. Canada has a major role to play, given that it has much at stake in protecting its own oceans and coasts. So as a polar nation, Canada's increased involvement in the Antarctic will be important, not just for Canada, but for the international community. It's not. Okay. Now, to give you a brief overview of the Antarctic Treaty and the Antarctic Treaty System, these guide the governance of an international political region where scientific and logistical cooperation among many nations has thrived over 60 years. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in December 1959 by 12 countries with Antarctic interests. These nations had established scientific programs and operated a total of 60 research stations within the region during the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. The IGY, as it's called, was a major turning point for Antarctic governance. It transformed national activities from primarily political to primarily scientific operations. It led to the founding of the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, or SCAR, and the Antarctic Treaty, which of course entered into force in June 1961. SCAR plays a central role in providing that independent scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty members. It also initiates, promotes, and coordinates scientific research. So Antarctic governance has evolved from a relatively straightforward treaty arrangement to a rather complex system. But by the time the treaty was negotiated in the late 1950s, 7 territorial claims had been made by Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom. And of course, as the slide shows, those of Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom overlap. And the legal basis for these claims are grounded in exploration and geographical discovery, symbolic acts, administrative acts, occupation, and science. The United States and Russia, of course, do not recognize any of these claims. However, both reserve the right to make a claim in the future if the Antarctic Treaty were ever to collapse. The treaty's principal provisions include promoting the freedom of scientific research, facilitation of international scientific cooperation, the use of the continent for peaceful purposes only, and the prohibition of military activities, nuclear tests, and the disposal of radioactive waste. One of the most important provisions is Article 4 of the treaty. It freezes the 7 territorial claims for the duration of the treaty by not recognizing or denying them. It could be argued that the treaty, in effect, diffused the sovereignty issue in Antarctica. So the negotiations that led to the Antarctic Treaty took place during a period of heightened Cold War tension and are often considered a fine example of how science can be used as an effective diplomatic tool. So in short, 3 key elements are central to the governance of the Antarctic continent and its surrounding waters: the suspension of all territorial claims, the accordance of science as the only legitimate activity in the continent that also informs the management and protection of its environment and resources, and finally, governance by consensus decision-making. So the governance of Antarctica has evolved to respond to new issues, both inside and outside the Antarctic region. A series of measures and conventions have broadened that capacity to govern its living resources and human activities there. And as the slide shows, these include, of course, conservation of Antarctic fauna and flora, conservation of seals, marine living resources, and of course, the Protocol on Environmental Protection, which is also known as the Madrid Protocol, signed in 1991, and it came into force in 1998, and it bans all forms of mining in the region. The membership is diverse, and it's growing. Currently, there are 42 more countries have become signatories to the treaty since it came into force. Membership is 2-tiered. There are currently 29 consultative party members who are called ATCPs, or Antarctic Treaty Consultative Parties, who hold decision-making powers and policy-making power for all of the membership. And there are 25 non-consultative parties who are observers, and hoping that's going to reduce to 24 when Canada becomes a consultative party. The original signatories have been joined by emerging global powers like China and India as consultative parties. Science is the political currency of credibility in Antarctica. The level and extent of scientific engagement in Antarctica is key to exercising a nation's influence under the treaty system. To gain and maintain that decision-making power or consultative status, new members have to demonstrate substantial interest in the Antarctic, or rather conduct substantial scientific research activity there. Now, establishing a station was once a precondition for conducting that substantial scientific research. But this is no longer the case. Science undertaken in cooperation with other countries has now become an acceptable basis for attaining full membership. So when the treaty was signed in 1959, the Antarctic was peripheral to the global political mainstream. It is now an increasingly important region of international scientific, political, and environmental concern. This has arisen, of course, because of worries over the ozone hole, impacts of global climate change, threats to polar biodiversity, anxieties over future interest in the resource potential of the Antarctic, a more diverse membership, and the geopolitical tensions arising from a shifting international order. Other activities such as tourism, shipping, fishing, bioprospecting in the Southern Ocean have increased rapidly. So over the last few decades, shipborne tourism has brought a large number of seasonal visitors to the continent. Bioprospecting, for example, may place pressure on established conventions such as the free exchange of information because of commercial considerations. Today, there are 41 year-round and 39 seasonal scientific stations. Countries expect to capitalize on their investment in scientific programs, which require considerable funding and logistics. So the increase in the scientific research has led to concern over the management of human activities and how best to limit and avoid environmental impacts, while at the same time allowing for the use of Antarctica for the global good. And here, both SCAR and the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, COMNAP, have significant roles in the governance of Antarctica and its surrounding waters. COMNAP's purpose is to develop and promote best practice in managing and supporting scientific research in Antarctica. It provides practical and technical advice drawn from the National Antarctic Program's pool of expertise. Now, I know that we only have 15 minutes, so there's a lot to pack in here. But in closing, I just want to mention briefly about the two significant agreements associated with the Antarctic Treaty that will play a critical role in defining how successful international cooperation may be over the next decade or so. The first is CAMLR, or the Convention of the Conservation of Marine Living Resources, and the regulation of fishing in the Southern Ocean, as well as the governance of marine protected areas. The other will relate to the ongoing debate over the future of mining prohibition under the 1991 Protocol on Environmental Protection. Now, CAMLR was established in 1982 in response to increasing commercial interest in Antarctic krill resources. It does not prohibit or exclude fishing or the harvest of Antarctic krill. It follows an ecosystem-based management approach. However, species such as the Patagonian toothfish and Antarctic icefish have been harvested illegally in some instances. Antarctic krill fishing is increasing with the main fleets coming from Norway, China, Russia, and South Korea. CAMLR's mandate has developed to cover a wide range of Antarctic species, habitats, and ecosystems. It is also committed to establishing a network of marine protected areas, or MPAs, around the continent. So far, CAMLR has created MPAs in the South Orkney Islands in 2009, Ross Sea in 2017. In opposition to creating 3 new MPAs last year, unfortunately, did not happen because primarily due to Russia and China. Both countries cited issues with the conservation measure that established CAMLA's NPA designation process, even though it had been unanimously approved in 2009 by all CAMLA members, including Russia and China. This is my last slide, so I hope I'm doing okay for time, Laura, but this is, thank you. I thought I'll include a picture of Canada Glacier as the sort of the backdrop as I talk about the other vital agreement that's associated with the Antarctic Treaty, which is the Protocol on Environmental Protection, which bans all forms of mining in the region. Now, the protocol, it underscores the principle that Antarctica must be regarded as a protected area to be utilized only for peaceful purposes and to maintain it as a continent for science. Now, to give you some important historical context here, the treaty parties had spent over a decade from 1977 to 88 negotiating the terms for mining regulation in Antarctica. But the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities, or CRAMRA as it came to be known, failed to be ratified by all the consulted parties in 1989. Divisions among the treaty parties threatened the disintegration of the Antarctic Treaty system, just as the Antarctic Treaty was approaching its 30th year in 1991 for a potential review. CRAMRA was dropped in favor of a protocol on environmental protection. Like the Antarctic Treaty, the protocol has no scheduled end in its text. However, any consultative party can request to review it after 2048, at which time the parties have 3 years to ratify a modified or amended protocol into force. Now, this means that if a consultative party chooses to bring the protocol under review in 2048, and a new protocol is not entered into force by 2051, any party can withdraw from the protocol, engage in mineral resource activities, and begin mining. So one final point here is that while the Antarctic Treaty can last indefinitely, provisions exist for a conference to review the operation of the treaty once it had been in force for 30 years. That is during or any time after 1991. To date, of course, no such conference has been suggested. It is, of course, impossible to predict what the global economy will look like in 2048 when the protocol may come up for review. An energy-hungry world with growing population could potentially redefine the purpose and use of Antarctica and its surrounding waters. Regardless, science in Antarctica engenders a spirit of international cooperation and collaboration inspired by shared responsibilities to protect the environment and indeed the future of the planet. So it is critical that the processes of cooperation and collaboration, as well as sharing ideas and resources among all treaty parties, are not only sustained, but are strengthened. Thank you very much. I hope I've kept to time.
Thank you very much, Anita. We have 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A, but I think we'll save them for after Dermot's presentation. So I'll introduce Dermot now. Dermot Antoniadis is an associate professor in the Geography Department and the Center for Northern Studies at Université Laval in Quebec City. He holds a Canada Research Chair in Aquatic Environments and Water Quality. Dermot studies lakes and their sedimentary records to understand the effects of climate change and anthropogenic processes on freshwater environments on both short and long-term timescales. His research has a strong polar focus. He has active ongoing projects in the Canadian High Arctic, the Antarctic Peninsula, and Greenland.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you may be. I'm speaking today from Montevideo in Uruguay, where I'm spending my sabbatical embedded with the Uruguayan Antarctic Institute to work on projects together. And I'm presenting today as a member of CCAR, and also just as an example of a Canadian researcher. I'm going to spotlight a couple of projects that I'm undertaking with colleagues and my graduate students, and also explain a bit about my trajectory, how a Canadian comes to be involved in research and working with different scientists in different countries from around the world. So the first thing I want to do is just give a little bit of context here about the climate. I don't think I have to convince anyone probably that Antarctica is a continent of extremes, being extremely cold, extremely dry, the highest continent, the windiest continent. And generally, we split it into East Antarctica and West Antarctica, where East Antarctica is the more extreme part of the continent, while slightly less extreme being West Antarctica, which includes the Antarctic Peninsula, which at its closest point is roughly 900 kilometers from the southern tip of South America. So first question someone might ask is, why as a Canadian do I study Antarctica? I think between the three previous people who've spoken, the importance of Antarctica in a global context has already been explained, so I don't need to go over that. But also for me, as a scientist with a strong Arctic focus to my research, I see many analogies between the ecosystems that I find in the north and the south, in the effects of climate change and human development in those regions. And so I think that the studies that we carry out in Antarctica can help to inform us about similar challenges that are faced in the Canadian North. So I think from a Canadian perspective, that's an important aspect. So here, just to present a bit about the climate, on the right side, there are a couple of figures that present measured temperature records from the climate stations that are shown in the panel at left. And it's already been mentioned that the Antarctic is warming. The Antarctic Peninsula in particular has been the site of some of the most pronounced warming on Earth since the middle of the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, I'm not sure, can you see my arrow here, my cursor or not? Yes, you can, okay. So you see here in the beginning of the 20th century, there was what's been called a pause or a slight cooling in the warming trend. And then in the last 6 years or so, we've returned to that increased temperature trend that characterized the last half of the 20th century. Another characteristic of this record that you'll see is the line is quite wavy. There's a lot of interannual variability, and that's true in particular on the west side of the Antarctic Peninsula, where climate is thought and temperatures are thought to be linked to variations in the extent and thickness of sea ice in the ocean off to that side of the peninsula. So Anita showed a bit of this, the maps of the different stations around Antarctica. What I want to focus on is in the bottom right, which shows you the concentration of various different bases and stations in the South Shetland Islands and at the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So without going into any detail about who is where, it's just a comment about Canadians who, without our own logistical support program, we basically have two options. We either choose in which part of Antarctica we're interested in doing our research, and then we have to collaborate with the countries that are operating in that region. Or if we have contacts with researchers from a particular country, then that will determine which parts of the continent we can access via their national program logistics. So in my case, in the IPY, I went with a Spanish project to the South Shetland Islands in 2008, and that was where I began my work in Antarctica. So just a quick touch on what Anita's already mentioned, the increase in tourism. We can see the ever increasing numbers of tourists arriving to the continent, which again got to over 7,400 in 2019, 2020 before the pandemic hit. And then again, somewhere around 10,000 scientists per year going to the continent. So between 7 and 10 times as many tourists as scientists reaching the continent. If you look at the figure at the right, what I want to focus on are the green, yellow, and red shaded regions, which show the number of ship voyages per year. That includes both tourists and scientists. And you can see that big red region, which shows that the highest number of ships arriving is in the Antarctic Peninsula again, which is where the large majority of tourists going to Antarctica are going to visit. So just as a quick summary, the Antarctic Peninsula is a hotspot of climate change. it's a hotspot of scientific activity, and it's a hotspot of tourism. So there's a lot going on down there when we're trying to study the changes in the region. So I am a paleolimnologist, which basically means that I study environmental change through studies of lake sediments. So we take cores from the sediments laid down in the bottom of lakes. We look at microfossils, we look at geochemical signals, we look at physical properties in the sediments that are laid down there, and then we use these to determine the conditions in the past and how they have changed over time. What I'm going to focus on here today in my presentation is the region of the South Shetland Islands, shown at left. I've chopped off the north and south just to focus on the ones that I'll be mentioning today. From south to north, you can see, actually, I'm not finally going to be mentioning it, but this is Deception Island, which is a large volcano. You can see the rim of the crater and then the ocean that goes into the crater at the center. A bit farther north is Livingston Island with the Byers Peninsula. I'll be presenting some results from there. And then at the far north is King George Island with the Fildes Peninsula, again, that I'll be talking about a bit later. And what I'd just like to point out, hopefully you can see on this figure, is that the islands are, in their large majority, covered by ice, with just small regions around the margin that are ice-free and available for water and for organisms. So I'm going to present first from the Byers Peninsula on Livingston Island, circled in red at left. And this peninsula is an Antarctic special protected area, which means that it's off limits to tourists, and scientists need to apply for special permission to study there. And why is it a protected area? For a number of reasons. There are dense concentrations of fauna, including some of the animals you see on the screen: elephant seals, 3 different species of penguins, concentrations of petrels, and skua. In addition, there are also archaeological sites and artifacts related to early sealers in the mid-19th century who came there to hunt the elephant seals for their fat. The landscape is covered by lakes. It is the most significant freshwater site in the South Shetland Islands, which was one of the reasons that led to its protection, and also means that it's ideal for us to study if we want to look at lakes and their sediments. And so situated there is a Spanish summer field camp, which is where I went in 2 different summers to carry out my research. So the first study I'm going to present is a study of how we reconstructed patterns in glacial recession. The idea behind it being that if you know when a lake was formed, you know when the glaciers retreated from that location, because as soon as the ice is gone, the depressions in the landscape begin to fill with meltwater. So by studying a gradient across the landscape of different lakes, then you can determine the patterns of glacial recession. So along with my Spanish and in the second year Portuguese colleagues as well, we went pulling our gear around the peninsula, going to the site of different lakes and taking long cores to try to figure out when exactly these lakes were formed. So key to this was to recover the entire sedimentary sequence. What you'll see on the outside, the long of the slide, are 2 long cores, a few meters long, taken from several lakes that are shown in blue in the figure in the center. And the blow-ups in the inset there are showing the contact between lacustrine sediments and the glacial till underneath. So this is showing we've gotten the whole sediment infill of these lakes all the way back to when the landscape was covered by glaciers. And so then what we wanted to do was radiocarbon date the earliest lacustrine sediments, which would tell us when these lakes were formed. So then by doing this, we know the ages of various lakes around the landscape, and in combination with the interpretation of landscape features by some of our colleagues from Portugal and Spain, who are geomorphologists, this allowed us to infer how the Roch Dome Glacier, which is seen there, right, retreated across the landscape. And I'm not going to go into any details about the tendencies here, but what you can see in the various panels are snapshots at different moments in time, showing how we suppose that the glacier was configured and how it retreated to its present position. But sometimes we want to go a little deeper than that. We want to get more detailed information about the temperature. So I'm going to show some stratigraphies here, which if you're not familiar with them, they show the records of a sediment core. In the left, it's showing how we developed an age model where each one of the blue points is a radiocarbon age, and we had several dozen of them that allowed us to establish the relationship between the depth in the sediment and the age. So the y-axis there is the depth in centimeters of the sediment, and the x-axis is the years before present. And on the right, the y-axis has become the age in thousands of years before present, and that allows us to compare it to other records from elsewhere in Antarctica and around the world. And so in these cores that we've taken from these lakes, with colleagues from various countries, we've been able to analyze geochemistry, mineralogy, diatom microfossils, and they've given us some climate-related information. But what I'd like to spotlight briefly today are some new results that have been developed in collaboration with French colleagues that use lipid biomarkers that are produced by bacteria that allow us to reconstruct quantitatively past temperatures. So if we look at the curve in orange in the middle, this is using an inference model that was developed. This is a record of temperature for the last 5,000 or so years in the Buyers Peninsula from the sediment core. And it shows us, among other things, it shows us that there was quite a warm period between about 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, followed by the persistence of cooler conditions with some variability for several thousand years. And where this gets a little bit interesting is the black curve on the right is from an earlier study from an ocean core taken near southern South America, which shows the position of the westerlies in the southern hemisphere. And I don't want to get too bogged down in the detail of that work, but essentially it shows quite a strong relationship between the position of the westerlies and the temperature that we are reconstructing in the South Shetland Islands. So basically, when the westerlies move south, there are warmer temperatures in the Buyers Peninsula, indicative of warm winds or perhaps the effects of these westerlies on sea ice to the west of the Antarctic Peninsula that I mentioned. And then when they move north, we see colder conditions. So this is really quick, but just an illustration of a high resolution climate reconstruction that we're doing in the South Shetland Islands. So the second example I want to focus on is in the Filbus Peninsula on King George Island, the largest ice-free island area on that island, about 7 kilometers from the glacier to the opposite end. And it's a place that's been the site of a permanent human presence since Bellingshausen Station was established in 1968, with numbers increasing to a few hundred people in winter and more in summer. So I'm going to quickly flash through some slides here that focus on the central area of the peninsula, site of the most human occupation. We add the buildings of all the various stations of 5 different countries. To service that, we need an airport. Then you install the associated infrastructure, communications, roads, pipelines, and whatnot. And we go from a pristine landscape to one with quite a bit of a human footprint. These are just some examples showing vehicles that have emissions. There's accelerated erosion of sensitive landscape during road construction, off-road travel, and whatnot. Examples of human impacts. In the top left, we're drawing water for drinking water. There's garbage that, due to the cost of taking it away, ends up spending a fair amount of time on the landscape and is sometimes incinerated. And then there are fuel tanks that are used for vehicles and diesel generators, which lead to the possibility of having spills. And what you often see in the background are lakes, and whatever affects the lakes are preserved in their sediments. So we studied 5 impacted lakes, the sites shown in green, along with 2 control lakes farther away from the stations and therefore limited or not having any human impacts. And I'm going to very quickly show you the results of 3 of these lakes with the nice laminated sediments shown here on the left, Mondsee being the control and hotel, and Las Estrellas being the 2 that are in the impacted region near the airport. So very quickly, I'm not even going to go through these. These are diatom stratigraphies where each vertical series is a species, but those are really just for specialists. So I'm going to show you an analysis of a statistical analysis that extracts the trends. It's a redundancy analysis, which is a multivariate analysis summarizing overall climate community change. And what you see there is there isn't too much difference between our control lake on the left and our 2 lakes on the right. So remember, this is a site of some serious climate change in the last half century to century. So the question is climate the dominant signal instead of anthropogenic effects? But when we go a bit deeper and we start looking at metals in the sediments, what we see is the zinc to titanium ratio, which is basically a summary of metal enrichment in the sediments. We can see our control lake on the left has very little to no change throughout the 20th century up until when we cored the lakes, while Hotel and Las Estrellas show enrichment in zinc, a heavy metal that's used in diesel and aircraft fuel and mobilized by human activities. And we see that those increase in our lakes that are near the station. Next, and the three curves on the right are diatom teratologies, which are just deformations. You can see a normal diatom on the left, and then the other four, when they reproduced, they're deformed. You can see strange shapes, and this is causing mutations, which is often a stress response to increased heavy metals in lakes. And again, what you can see is our control lake, Mondsee, there's very little change, while in recent sediments, we've got quite a large increase in the proportion of diatoms that are deformed. So the question is, how does this compare with human activity? Well, that red line that I've just put on the screen is when the Bellingshausen, the first base, was established. And you can see that these effects are right around that time and increasing for the. It's quite difficult to have exact numbers on how many people are or were on the island or in that peninsula at any time. That information is not always freely available. But certainly what you can see is in the period of human occupation, we seem to be having changes in the lakes that are likely related to anthropogenic activities from stations and transport. So we have a few ongoing projects with different students who are studying lead stable isotopes, fossil pigments, and ancient DNA to try and give us a bit more information about what's going on and how it's associated with human activities. So very quickly, the last thing I want to touch on before I finish is how do we do research in Antarctica as Canadians? And this is just my personal story. I got involved in the Spanish project as a Canadian that later grew to include financing and logistics supported by Portugal. And over the years that we sampled, we were logistically supported by the Antarctic programs of Uruguay, of Brazil, of South Korea, and Argentina, and also had scientific collaborations with people from Great Britain. The Anthropogenic project is supported by Chile and by Canada, with logistical support also from Uruguay and collaborations with scientists from those countries, as well as from Spain and from France. And just as the last word, just last week, one of my PhD students came back from a voyage farther south on the Arctic Peninsula, supported by the Turkish Polar Program. So it's just a quick illustration of how Canadians can insert themselves in programs from all around the world and carry out their research goals that way. So just with thanks to all the different institutes and funding agencies that supported the research I showed, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Dermot, thank you very much. That your previous slide showing all the flags is certainly shows a broad range of countries. So we have a few questions in the Q&A, and I'll start with someone has asked, so why is it in Canada's interest to become a full member of the Antarctic Treaty? And Anita, I don't know if you would like to lead off?
Sure. I think, as I hope my presentation sort of conveyed, the global importance of Antarctica and the impacts that the Antarctic environment has globally and the rest of the globe has on Antarctica makes it really important for the international community to be engaged in a full manner in the governance and the management of Antarctica. So it is important why Canada should be involved in Antarctica.
Thanks, Anita. And a sort of a very practical reason that has been expressed to me is that there's a substantial tourism activity in Antarctica by Canadian tourism companies. And yet when decisions are taken on these kinds of activities in Antarctica without full consultative status, Canada actually does not have a vote. So that's a sort of a more immediate and practical response. And David, I was wondering if you wanted to comment on this question as well.
Well, just very briefly that Canada has made commitments to the rest of the world community around climate change and mitigation of climate change, understanding what's happening in the polar regions, the Earth's refrigerators, and how that affects the whole climate system, and how we can understand better what the impacts of mitigation strategies might be is something where our membership allows us, as Anita said, to be involved directly in those decisions. We are already contributing, but we need to find ways to improve and strengthen our commitment as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, an interesting question. Is there any punishment for not abiding by any of the legal instruments? And Anita, if you have thoughts on that, please.
Well, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very good question. But in terms of activities in Antarctica, again, it is especially members of the Antarctic Treaty. They are bound by national legislation that sort of manage their activities in the continent. So in a sense, if anybody, if there is punishment to be sort of given, it would come from the national agencies and the national members to Antarctic Treaty.
Okay. It's an interesting question and not one that I've seen before. I'll just comment that Antarctica, kind of by nature of the Antarctic Treaty, the focus on scientific research and so on, there's a sort of an underlying ethos, an expectation of best behavior. And, you know, in that context, I'm not sure how frequently this kind of issue is raised. Another question, how is tourism managed in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean? And I will maybe partially respond to that. In Canada, by virtue of the legislation that was passed, I think in 2003, David mentioned it near the beginning of this webinar. In order for Canadian companies to operate in Antarctica, they do have to apply for environmental permits that are assessed and scrutinized by Environment and Climate Change Canada. So there's that element of management. And if any of the panelists would like to comment further, please do so.
Yeah, I just want to add that the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings back in 2011 actually adopted general guidelines for visitors to Antarctic. So that's a sort of, there are rules that visitors have to follow when they are visiting Antarctica. And also perhaps it's important to know that there is an organization called IATO, which is the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators. And they are expected to cooperate with their national agencies to ensure that there is, and they are also, national operators need to be members of IATO to coordinate and cooperate to sort of manage what sort of activities with respect to tourism is planned in Antarctica. So I hope that helps. It's just some additional
yeah. No, I from personal experience, I can say that having spent some time at McMurdo, which is the large American base, there were seminars and so on. There was training that we had to do both for how to behave at the base and especially out in the field. It was taken quite seriously, actually. Dermot, what are your experiences working on the Antarctic Peninsula with a number of different nations? With regard to sort of, I guess, environmental issues and
Generally, all the different programs that I've worked with have been quite stringent in terms of the training that's been given and the instructions we've been given about how to act when we're out sampling and whatnot. I think where it occasionally breaks down is once people are away from the bases and out on their own, they're tempted by getting a particular picture with an animal or whatnot. In terms of I guess that's in terms of disturbance, but in terms of actual pollution or destruction of the landscape or whatnot, I think we're generally quite conscious of avoiding that as much as possible. And I guess it's really with the larger activity related to infrastructure and transportation where I suspect a lot of that is becoming an issue.
Right. No. Thanks, Dermot. Dermot, a question for you. You mentioned that you do work in the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. And how does your Arctic research and your Antarctic research relate to each other or talk to one another?
Well, I mean, the first part is, I guess, a lot of the methods that we develop either in the north or south are applicable to the opposite pole in terms of how we're going to develop records of past changes. But then in terms of looking at the work we do with the anthropogenic impacts, certainly the development and the sensitivity of ecosystems, the climate of the Antarctic Peninsula is fairly similar to quite a few parts of the Canadian Arctic. So if we can understand how this kind of development and increased infrastructure is affecting the ecosystems there, it's going to help us sort of maybe prevent making the same mistakes in the north as the north continues to develop, or at least understand how ecosystems might be affected. So I think there are quite a few analogies, mainly because of the parallels between, when I'm working with lakes, they're lakes with similar ice cover conditions, similar cold winters with dark for a certain amount of the year. And again, starting off from pristine status and moving towards increasing perturbations due to human presence.
Thanks, Dermot. David, I have a question for you. I understand you need to leave shortly, but there's a question from Peter Williamson. If Canada's Antarctic Treaty application is approved, I'm wondering if there are plans for Arctic-Antarctic Indigenous exchanges and mutual capacity building activities, such as with the Maori in New Zealand, who have been active in Antarctic research and are world leaders in Indigenous self-determination.
Yeah, so Peter, thanks for that. The answer is yes, there have been discussions, and I think that's something we're looking forward to developing as in the coming year or two, exploring some of those possibilities. And then there's some, I think, great interest both from the Canadian side and from the New Zealand side. And maybe there's other possibilities as well. We need to look into that.
Thanks, David. I see we have 2 more questions in the Q&A. We've gone 6 minutes over. So my thought is we'll ask these last 2 questions and then perhaps wrap up. I'm an Arctic, this is from Timothy James. I'm an Arctic focused polar scientist, and it's been so interesting to hear a Canadian perspective on Antarctic research. I understand the importance of Canada's involvement in Antarctic governance and research, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether there is a risk that increased Canadian Antarctic focus will divert funding away from research that's needed within Canada's borders.
Tom, perhaps as chair of CCAR, probably you should respond to that.
So my thought on that. So that is an issue that this is not the first time that this question is posed, and it's an important question. We have a vast Arctic, and concerns that we're not doing everything we need to in the Arctic. And I think part of the response is that, first of all, the environment genuinely has changed with the establishment, for example, of the Canadian High Arctic Research Station, and the capacities that brings, ongoing investment in Arctic research and an understanding by the government of how important this is. Arctic research is on stronger terms, arguably, than it has been in the past. And when we turn to Antarctica, I think it's important to look at the benefits and not just the costs. And one of the most important benefits is this engagement with this very large polar research community. And it's an issue not just of Canadians bringing knowledge to that community, because we do bring knowledge to that community by virtue of our own experience in the Arctic, but we also learn an enormous amount that we can then bring back to Canada. And some of that is direct impact. Some of it is mediated by what we do in the Arctic and the kind of the bipolar knowledge exchange, but some of it's also quite direct. Our interest and involvement in Antarctic ice sheet evolution and the implications that that has for sea level change have direct impact to Canadian coastlines. And I bring that example forward because that's a key part of my research interest, is understanding how the Antarctic ice sheet is going to affect sea level change. So, Canada, where we live in the globe, the climate system is global in nature, and a sustained effort in Antarctica contributes to Canada in direct ways and also in direct and indirect ways. So that would be my spiel, I guess. And Anita, Dermot, you're welcome to amplify on that if you wish.
I guess the only thing I'd say is as you say, it's a comment we've heard previously, and I just don't think the right way to look at it is as a zero-sum game, where necessarily if we're studying the Antarctic, we must be taking away from research in the Arctic. I quite honestly don't see any reason why both can't be done. And the reality is I have a much easier time finding funding and resources to study the North than I do the South, which I do basically on a shoestring and with the goodwill of my partners from other countries around the world. So I really don't see Canadian Antarctic science as a threat to what we're doing in the North.
Right. Thanks, Dermot.
I think I just echo both your points to say that, both Antarctic and Arctic science, I mean, they are complementary to each other, and there's a lot to be learned from and drawn from each of the disciplines that are covered in both the polar regions. So if anything, it would strengthen Arctic science and vice versa.
Thanks. One final question for Anita. What do you predict the future of mining to be in Antarctica?
Good question. Can we have a separate webinar on this? It's difficult to tell at this point in time because there are so many aspects in terms of technology, what can be done, whether there is going to be, activities that are environmentally friendly or not. There's no one answer. What the future will be, it's very difficult to tell, but I hope that whatever that future is going to be, it will be done in an environmentally responsible way. And I bring in CRAMRA that I mentioned to you in my talk about the Minerals Regulations Convention discussion that was sort of drafted. And there are a number of good guidelines as to how, if minerals activities were to happen in Antarctica, how best it can protect those activities so it's not doesn't have a negative impact on the environment. But I think we have to be realistic at some point, and maybe not now, maybe in 50 years' time, who knows? There might be potential to mine. But that mining activity has to be done very responsibly. And therefore, I think, again, talking about why Canada should be involved, countries like Canada with the technical know-how, with strong scientific research backgrounds. There's a lot that could be contributed to resource management issues. So I don't know whether that really answers the question. As I say, there's a lot that could be said, and perhaps we could have a separate webinar on it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And of course, it's a question that I suppose no one really knows the answer. Well, with that, I'd like to thank both of you for your presentations and for participating in the panel discussion. Thanks to all the attendees who are still here, where people are starting to drop away. We have gone a little bit over, and I'm going to just leave the final remarks for Laura. But again, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Anita, I'm going to call on you. It sounds like a great, sounds like a great webinar topic. So yeah, you're on notice.
Okay.
Tom, thank you so much for moderating today, because you're a chair of the Canadian Committee on Antarctic Research, and with all your work with Polar Knowledge Canada to promote Canadian Antarctic research, I can't think of anybody better to moderate our discussions today. So thank you very much. So this wraps up our series, our knowledge sharing series. Thank you to everybody who's been involved, and thank you to all the attendees. Just to note again that we hope to have more of these webinars in the future, featuring Anita talking about mining in the Antarctic, amongst many, many other conversations that we can have. And our previous conversations have included Indigenous knowledge holders, and they have just been such a rich conversation, and we're really thankful to be able to have this opportunity. We do have video recordings of the entire series of 6 webinars. They will be posted on Polar's YouTube channel and possibly other locations. And I think the best way to access those is to visit the Polar website. Give it a couple of weeks because we have to edit the videos, and also watch their YouTube channel, and probably Facebook's probably about the best place to go. If you go over to their Facebook page and like their page, you'll get some notifications about when those videos are available and about future events. So thank you again to everybody, and we will end it there, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.